This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. The tradition of Kaidan reminds us that the world we see is merely a thin veil. Sometimes that veil tears, not in ancient ruins, but in the glow of a smartphone or the silence of a vacant apartment. Tonight, we explore the spaces where identities dissolve and fate becomes a trap. These are stories of the uncanny and the inevitable, where the reflection in the mirror has its own agenda, and the dead refuse to be forgotten. Settle in. The reality you left behind is already beginning to shift. Chapter 1. The Future Call Log. I was in the university library hunting for research materials when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I checked the screen and saw a new entry in my call log. The time on the call was listed as just now, but I knew for a fact I hadn't dialed anyone. The name on the screen was Chris, a guy from my senior seminar. Spooked, I deleted the entry immediately, but a second later, my search history started filling up with phrases I hadn't typed. The next day on campus, I brought it up to Chris. He just frowned at me, looking confused. "What are you talking about? We talked yesterday," he said. "Wait, yesterday?" I stammered. "Yeah, check your phone. It's right there in the history." The blood drained from my face. I checked, and sure enough, there was a record of a call between us from the previous afternoon. A strange mix of curiosity and pure terror gripped me. I decided to test it. I picked a friend I definitely hadn't spoken to yet, a girl named Sarah, and hit dial. She picked up and sounded exasperated. "We literally just talked. What do you want now?" I hung up without saying a word. When I looked at the logs again, they were being populated with events from the future. My presentation in class, a minor fender bender in the parking lot next week, a small accident during my shift at the coffee shop. Everything that was about to happen was already written down. At first, I tried to make the most of it. I finished my assignments days in advance and stayed one step ahead of everyone at work. But then, a new notification appeared in the log. Death. Fatal traffic accident. I started shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. I tried to change my routine to avoid it, but the phone would start operating itself, sending messages and making appointments that forced me back onto the path. I realized then that I didn't have a choice. I had to follow the log. I stood at the edge of the crosswalk, and just as the log predicted, a car blew through the intersection. I stayed exactly where I was supposed to, and the car missed me by inches. I was safe. But then I looked down at my phone. One last line had been added to the bottom of the screen. "Next time, make sure there's no deviation from the log." My skin crawled. It seems I'm no longer the one in control of my own life. Chapter 2. The Unlocked Room. The apartment next to mine had been vacant for years. At least, that was what I had been told. But late at night, I started hearing the unmistakable sounds of someone living there. A chair scraping across the floor, the low hum of a television, the muffled thud of footsteps. I asked the building manager about it, but he just gave me a weird look and insisted the unit was empty. One night, the noise became too much to ignore. Trembling, I walked out into the hallway and stood before the neighbor's door. To my surprise, it was not even locked. I took a deep breath, pushed it open, and stepped inside. My breath hitched. The layout was an exact replica of my own place. Not just the floor plan, but everything else too. The same coffee table with the ring stain from a mug, the same pile of books on the nightstand, the same brand of cereal on the counter. And then I saw her. Another version of me was standing there, going about her evening. When she turned to face me, her features were a perfect match for mine. The only difference was her smile. It was just a little too wide, a little too sharp. "Hello," she said. My heart nearly leaped out of the chest. In the days that followed, that other version of me began to seize control of my life. When I went to cook dinner, I would find my ingredients had vanished. My clothes would disappear from my closet, only to be seen hanging in the apartment next door. Then came the night I caught her eye through the doorway. The moment our gazes locked, she reached out and clicked the door shut. I grabbed the handle and yanked it open, but the world had flipped. I was standing in the middle of the vacant unit. I looked back toward my own home, but it was completely gutted. No furniture, no clothes, no trace of my life. It was as if I had never existed at all.
Chapter 3. The Shadow Driver.
I opened my delivery app to start the dinner rush, but I froze when I saw the profile screen. There was another driver registered with my exact name and my photo. "What the hell is this?" I muttered, staring at my own face on the display. Before I could even process it, the complaints started rolling in. "You were just here?" a customer snapped when I arrived at their door. "I already got my food 10 minutes ago. Get lost." I checked the live map. This other version of me was moving at impossible speeds, completing deliveries before I could even pick them up, intercepting my orders and stealing every 5-star rating. Driven by a mix of confusion and pure adrenaline, I used the app's GPS to track his last known location. I caught up to him in a quiet suburban driveway. When he turned around, my heart stopped. It was me. Not a twin, but me, just a little older, with a cold, hollow look in his eyes that I did not recognize. "Your timeline only exists to fuel mine," he said, his voice a raspy, distorted echo of my own. My phone violently in my hand. A notification banner slid across the top. Account deleted. User no longer exists. A wave of vertigo hit me. I tried to reach for my bike, but my hand passed right through the handlebars. I looked down and gasped. My bike was gone. My delivery bag had vanished. My very body was becoming translucent, blurring at the edges and bleeding into the evening air like smoke. I was being erased from existence, piece by piece. My future self did not move to help. He just stood there, laughing under the glow of the streetlights, as I felt myself dissolve into nothingness.
Chapter 4. The Invisible Colleague. A new guy started at the mid-sized office where I work. He has a voice, and he casts a shadow, but he is completely invisible. "Hey, Miller, do you have those reports from yesterday?" my boss asked, looking directly at a patch of empty air. Everyone else was chatting with him like it was the most natural thing in the world. I was the only one who realized there was absolutely nothing there. At first, it just felt creepy, but then I started noticing my own hands and feet beginning to turn translucent. During a staff meeting, I tried to raise my hand to speak, but my arm seemed to dissolve into the light, my physical form overlapping with the empty space where the invisible colleague sat. By lunchtime, the break room was buzzing with the usual gossip. I tried to jump into the conversation, but my voice didn't make a sound, and not a single head turned my way. When I tried to use the copier, the tray moved and the buttons clicked as if by magic, but no one acknowledged my presence. My computer screen began to flicker and scroll on its own. One afternoon, my manager called me into his office. I stood right in front of his desk, but he looked straight through me, his eyes vacant. I had a voice, but I couldn't speak. I had a body, but I couldn't be seen. I realized then that the entire company had become a world of transparent employees, where we all existed only as functions, fading away until there was nothing left but the work.
Chapter 5. The Red Light That Never Changed. The stoplight on my way to campus got stuck on red. It just stayed there, a glowing crimson eye that refused to change. Everyone around me stopped too, rooted to the sidewalk. "This is a glitch, right?" I muttered to Mark, my best friend standing right next to me. He did not answer. He did not even blink. I nudged his shoulder, but he was as solid and cold as a stone statue. I gathered my courage and stepped out into the intersection. The moment my foot hit the asphalt, the entire world ground to a halt. I had slipped into a pocket of time where I was the only living thing left. I wandered through the neighborhood, passing neighbors frozen mid-stride and cars idling in silence. People looked like department store mannequins, their faces blank, their voices silenced. Eventually, the world seemed to lurch back to life. The light finally turned green, and the engines roared. But as the crowd surged forward, they walked right through me. I tried to grab Mark's arm, but my hand passed through him like mist. I was still standing there, trapped on the far side of the signal. Now, every morning, I take my place at that same corner, a shadow in the daylight, living an invisible life that no one will ever notice. Chapter 6. The Unknown Friend Request. I have never been a big fan of social media, but I keep an account for work as part of our public relations outreach. I was scrolling through my notifications after a long shift when a friend request popped up. The name was Ben Sullivan. The profile picture was a kid, maybe 9 or 10 years old, smiling at the camera. I did not recognize him. "Who is this?" I muttered, clicking on the profile. There were no posts, just a single line in the bio. "Finally found you." A chill crawled at my neck. The next day, I mentioned it to my coworker, Mike, while we were in the break room. "Man, that is definitely some creep or a bot." "Just ignore it," he said. "I know, but it is weird. I feel like I have heard that name somewhere before." Mike laughed and took a sip of his coffee. "There are probably a million Ben Sullivans in the world. You are just psyching yourself out." But when I got home that night, there was another notification. It was a message from Ben Sullivan. "We can finally meet." I blocked the account instantly. But a few hours later, a new request arrived from a different profile. This time, the name was Benny Sullivan, but it was the same photo of the kid and the same bio. "Finally found you." I dropped my phone on the couch like it was made of lead. 3 days later, my mom called from my hometown. "Hey,
"Do you remember a boy named Ben Sullivan?" she asked. My blood turned to ice. "Ben? No, why?" "He was in your class back in elementary school. He used to get picked on a lot, but you were always nice to him. You two used to play together all the time. I do not remember him." "Really? It was such a tragedy. He was the one who drowned in the river that summer." My mind went completely blank. I crawled under the covers, trying to force myself to sleep, when my phone chimed on the nightstand. I reached for it with trembling fingers. There was one new message. "You finally remembered. I have been waiting." The next second, the camera app opened by itself. The screen showed my bedroom ceiling, and then a child's face peered down into the lens, wearing a jagged, unnatural grin. The moment his name left my lips, the screen went pitch black, and I lost consciousness. When I woke up, my phone was nowhere to be found. But when I checked my profile on my computer, the sidebar showed a single update. Friends 1. Chapter 7. The Borrowed Bag. I was a broke high school kid. I wore the same beat-up clothes and the same worn-out sneakers every single day, so I was always jealous of the things the other kids had. One day, on my way home, I stumbled across a tiny, cramped thrift store I'd never noticed before. Inside the dusty shop, a brand-new backpack caught my eye. It was a high-end brand, the kind of thing I could never normally afford. "How much for this?" I asked the owner. $10, and it is yours," he said, a slow, greasy grin spreading across his face. I practically threw the money at him and bolted out the door. The next day at school, I wore the bag with pride. My classmates actually noticed me for once. "Nice bag, man," one said. "Is that a designer brand?" another asked. "It really suits you." My heart was racing. For the first time in my life, I felt like I finally fit in. But after school, I found a notebook inside the main pocket that I had not noticed before. On the cover, someone had scrawled "Give it back" in thick, jagged strokes of black Sharpie. When I got home and showed my mom, she just frowned. Her eyes filled with unease. "Get rid of it, Leo. That bag gives me a bad feeling." "But I just bought it," I argued. "The real owner is probably looking for it." "It is not yours," she insisted. Reluctantly, I decided to take the notebook back to the shop the next day. But when I got to the street where the store had been, there was nothing but an empty, weed-choked lot. The shop had vanished without a trace. That was when the nightmares started. Every night, a teenage boy I did not recognize appeared in my dreams. He was wearing a school varsity jacket, his voice a low, raspy hiss. "Give it back. That is mine." Every time I woke up, drenched in a cold sweat, the backpack was sitting right there on my pillow. No matter where I hid it, the back of the closet, the basement, the trash, it always found its way back to my bedside. One night, out of pure terror and frustration, I tried to fight back. I lunged at the boy in my dream and swung my fist as hard as I could. I felt the sickening thud of my knuckles connecting with his face. I bolted upright in bed, gasping for air. When I looked in the mirror, my own cheek was purple and swollen with a massive bruise. Sobbing with fear, I grabbed the bag, ran down to the river, and hurled it as far as I could into the dark, rushing water. But the next morning, there it was, sitting right on my front porch. It was soaking wet,
dripping a steady stream of muddy water onto the welcome mat. He is still there every night, whispering in my ear, "Give it back." But I do not know what he wants anymore. I do not know what is left to give.
Chapter 8. The Fair Trade. I am a retired old man, living a quiet, solitary life since my wife passed away. One afternoon, while I was sitting on a bench outside the local pharmacy, a young man in a sharp suit approached me. "Excuse me, sir," he said. "Are you satisfied with your life?" "Who are you supposed to be?" I asked, squinting at him. "It is simple, really," he replied with a smooth, practiced smile. "You just give me something you do not want in exchange for something you do." I figured he was some kind of street preacher or a scam artist, but then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small, plain wooden box. "Just place what you do not want inside this box," he said, "and in return, I will give you what you have been longing for." Half doubting and feeling a bit foolish, I closed my eyes and imagined putting my crushing loneliness into that box. I clicked the lid shut and handed it back. Starting the very next day, my house was suddenly full of life. My grandkids started dropping by every afternoon, and the neighbors were constantly knocking on my door to check in. "Hey, Grandpa, we are back," my granddaughter Lily would shout as she burst through the front door. "Thought you might need a hand with the yard work, Arthur," my neighbor Bill said as he showed up with his mower. I was so happy I could have cried. For the first time in years, the heavy silence of my home was gone. But a few weeks later, things took a dark turn. The other seniors in my neighborhood, people who lived alone just like I used to, started taking their own lives, one after another. "Why is this happening?" I whispered to myself, watching the flashing lights of another ambulance parked down the street. Then the young man appeared again. "A trade must always be fair," he said, leaning casually against my white picket fence. "What did you do?" I demanded, my voice trembling. "Your loneliness did not just vanish," he said, his eyes cold and empty. "It had to go somewhere. It was simply redistributed to the others." A chill ran down my spine. I tried to shove the box back into his hands. "Take it back. I do not want this." "I am afraid that is impossible," he said. "The transaction is complete." With that, he vanished into the evening shadows. I still spend my days surrounded by people. My house is loud, full of laughter and constant conversation. But every time I smile, I feel the weight of someone else's despair pressing against my shoulders. And in the quiet moments between the laughter, I can hear a chorus of hollow, desperate voices whispering right behind me. "Give it back," they hiss. I keep smiling for my guests, but behind the mask, those voices are all I ever hear. Chapter 9. The Memory Shop. The Memory Shop. I remember that night with perfect clarity. I was heading home from work, stumbling through a narrow side street near the subway station. Maybe it was the 3 drinks I'd had at happy hour, but my feet felt heavy and the world seemed to tilt at the edges. I found myself in a back alley I usually avoided, and that was where I saw the flyer. It was taped to the glass of a rusted-out payphone booth. The words were scrawled in thick black permanent marker,
Messy but strangely captivating. Memories for rent, $10 a night. I thought it was a joke. Below the text was a crude map, a name, Silas, and a phone number. I let out a sharp, cynical laugh. Renting memories? It sounded like some bottom-tier psychic scam or a weird New Age cult. But even after I crawled into bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Maybe it was the lingering buzz of the alcohol, but curiosity eventually got the better of me. I picked up my phone and dialed the number. A low, gravelly voice answered on the second ring. "Hello? I want to rent a memory," I said, the words feeling ridiculous as they left my mouth. I could hear the faint smile in his voice. "You know where to find me. Follow the map." The shop was tucked away at the very end of that dark alley. There was no sign, no doorbell, just a single unit in a dilapidated brick walk-up that looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint since the 70s. The air inside was thick and smelled of old paper and stagnant dust, illuminated by a dim, flickering orange bulb. An old man sat behind a small, scarred wooden table. His back was hunched, but his eyes were unnervingly sharp. "Welcome," he said immediately, as if he'd been counting the seconds until I arrived. "Can you really rent me a memory?" I asked, my skepticism warring with a sudden, inexplicable tension. "Yes," he rasped. "For one night, you can experience a fragment of someone else's life as a dream. The fee is $10. He pointed to a small wooden box on the table. Still half convinced I was being played, I pulled a $10 bill from my wallet and dropped it inside. The old man grinned, revealing yellowed teeth, and reached out to press a single fingertip against my forehead. "Sweet dreams," he whispered. That night, I dreamt. It wasn't my memory. I was a young boy again, wearing a heavy backpack and holding hands with a little girl in pigtails as we walked home from school. I felt the frantic, fluttering heartbeat of a first crush, the warmth of the sun on my neck, the smell of mown grass. When I woke up, my heart was still racing. The experience had been so vivid, so visceral, that I felt a pang of genuine nostalgia for a childhood that wasn't mine. I was stunned. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever felt. After that, I went back to see Silas again and again. $10 felt like a steal. Why live my own boring life when I could experience the highlights of 1,000 others? One night, I was swimming through the turquoise waters of a Caribbean island. Another, I was sitting at a crowded Thanksgiving table, surrounded by the laughter of a family I'd never met. I even experienced the terrifying, adrenaline-soaked memory of a soldier on a front line. I cried, I laughed, I felt despair, and I felt triumph. I was drowning in the dreams. But soon, the cracks started to show in my waking life. I was at the office when my manager walked up to my desk. "Hey, David," he said. I froze. For a split second, the name sounded foreign. David? Is that me? I actually had to glance at my own ID badge to confirm it. Things got weirder. The rented memories began to bleed into my own history. At a high school reunion, I started telling a story about a bad motorcycle accident I'd had in my 20s. My old friends just stared at me, confused. "You never owned a bike, Dave," one of them said. "You've never even broken a bone." I realized then that the accident wasn't mine. It was a memory I'd rented weeks ago. My own past was becoming a blur, a deck of cards shuffled with someone else's life. I was losing the thread of who I actually was. Yet I couldn't stop. My real life was gray, lonely, and hollow. In the dreams, I was loved. I was adventurous. I was alive. One night, I finally asked the old man, "Where do these memories come from? Whose lives am I living?" Silas narrowed his eyes, his voice a dry whisper. "They belong to those who came before you, fragments of the people who visited this room. Your memories, too, will be rented out one day." A cold shiver ran down my spine. My memories? "Of course," he said, his grin widening into something predatory. "The transaction must always be equal." The end came without warning. I woke up one morning and realized I couldn't remember my own name. I looked around my apartment, but nothing looked familiar. I checked my desk for a passport, a driver's license, a bank statement, anything to prove I existed. They were all gone. My wallet was empty. I grabbed my phone, but the contact list was a sea of white space. Every trace of my identity had been hollowed out. I ran back to the alley, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But the shop was gone. The entire walk-up had vanished, replaced by a blank brick wall that looked decades old. I caught my reflection in a shop window. A stranger's face looked back at me. I knew it was my body, but I didn't recognize the man in the glass. I don't know who I am. I don't know where I came from. Now, when I sleep, I see glimpses of a man's life. I see him working at a desk, drinking at a bar, walking down a narrow side street toward a phone booth. I realize now that somewhere out there, someone is paying $10 to spend a night in my head. They are living my life while I am erased. And when that person finally wakes up, I will be nothing more than a rental, a ghost in someone else's dream. Chapter 10. The Two-Faced Sovereign. I work in construction, mostly demolition and site prep. A few weeks ago, we got a contract to tear down an old, deconsecrated chapel out in a remote part of rural Pennsylvania. It was one of those tiny, forgotten churches that hadn't seen a congregation in 50 years. While we were gutting the place, one of my co-workers, Dave, called me over. He sounded shaken. When I got to him, he was pointing at a long, blackened wooden box sitting at his feet. I asked him what it was, and he told me he'd found it in a tiny, windowless room hidden behind the back of the altar. He said he was going to call the Historical Society or the property owners to see what they wanted to do with it. The box was about 6 or 7 feet long, made of wood so old it looked like it was starting to rot or petrify. There was a strip of yellowed parchment stuck to the front with some kind of faded writing on it. It looked like ancient, archaic script, and through the cracks in the wood you could see something that looked like a religious statue. The paper was so brittle it was falling apart, but Dave said he managed to make out a few words using a translation app and some guesswork. It mentioned something about a ritual from July 1918 and a name, the Two-Faced Sovereign. The box was nailed shut with heavy iron spikes, so we didn't try to pry it open. We just moved it into the temporary site trailer for the night. The next morning, before I even made it to the site, I got a call from the property manager. He sounded frantic.
He told me the former pastor of the parish had called him and screamed at him to never, under any circumstances, open that box. The old man was apparently on his way to collect it himself. I figured I should call my site foreman and warn him, but when I got him on the line, his voice was trembling. He told me that 2 of our temp workers, a couple of college kids named Marco and Elias, had broken into the trailer during the night and forced the box open just for kicks. He told me to get down there as fast as I could. When I arrived, there was a small crowd gathered around the trailer. Marco and Elias were sitting on the ground in front of the door, staring into space. They looked like they'd seen a ghost. The foreman pulled me aside and told me I had to see what was inside. To put it bluntly, it was a mummy. It looked like a human body, but it was posed with its fists up like a prize fighter. The terrifying part was that it had 2 heads. It wasn't like any birth defect I'd ever seen in a textbook. It looked deliberate, or like some kind of sick taxidermy. The foreman said the kids hadn't said a word since they opened it. They were both fluent in English, but they were just catatonic, staring at nothing. I should mention that the mummy was truly grotesque. It had 2 heads joined at the neck, 4 arms, 2 on each side, and a normal pair of legs. I've seen some weird stuff on the internet, so I tried to tell myself it was just a freak of nature or a very convincing prop, but the energy coming off that thing was suffocating. We were debating whether to call the police when an old man, well into his 80s, pulled up in a car driven by his son. This was Reverend Miller, the former pastor. The old man didn't even wait for the car to stop before he was out and screaming at us. "You opened it? You idiots? It's over. Once it's open, it's over." He was terrifying. Then he turned on his son, Robert, and started berating him. "I told you to send the sovereign to that cathedral in D.C. years ago. I told you to get it out of here, you useless boy." He sounded like a man possessed, not a frail old preacher. He asked who opened it, and when we pointed to the 2 kids, he just shook his head. "They're gone," he whispered. "There's nothing left for them. But I'll try to shield the rest of you." We were all spooked enough that we didn't argue. He made us stand in a circle while he recited some low, rhythmic incantation that sounded more like a curse than a prayer. He took a heavy leather-bound book and struck us each across the shoulders and back with it hard. It went on for nearly 30 minutes. When he was done, he and his son loaded the wooden box into their car. As they were leaving, the Reverend looked at us with a look of pure pity. "I'm sorry," he said, "but none of you will live to see a long life now." A few days later, I heard that Marco had died in his hospital bed from a massive heart attack that the doctors couldn't explain. He was 20 years old. Elias was moved to a psychiatric ward and hasn't spoken a word since. 3 other guys from the crew came down with mysterious, high-grade fevers that kept them bedridden, and I ended up stepping on a rusted spike that went straight through my boot, requiring a dozen stitches and a hell of a lot of antibiotics. I don't know the full story, but I have a feeling that thing wasn't just a medical anomaly. It felt like something built out of pure, concentrated hatred. I found out later that the area where the chapel stood used to be an old, segregated shantytown for outcasts and the destitute. Maybe that has something to do with it. I couldn't let it go. I'm the kind of guy who can't stop poking at a sore tooth. I tried calling the Reverend, but he blocked me.
However, I managed to get the number for his son, Robert. He's a real estate developer, a flashy guy in his 50s, and he seemed a lot more approachable. I caught him late one night and managed to convince him to talk to me over the phone. He was talkative, maybe because he was a few drinks in. Robert told me that the thing in the box was a person or people from the early 1900s. He said they were conjoined twins who had been sold to a traveling freak show by their parents when they were children. They spent years being gawked at in sideshows across the Appalachian Trail. Eventually, they were bought by a man named Malachi Thorne. Thorne was the leader of a cult that most people have never heard of. A group so secretive and depraved that they make modern cults look like Sunday school. Thorne was obsessed with the dark arts, specifically a ritual he called the Devil's Crucible. He took several people with physical deformities and locked them in an underground chamber with no food. It was a human version of those ancient rituals where you put venomous insects in a jar and wait for the last one alive to consume the others. Thorne wanted the survivor to be the vessel for all that concentrated suffering and malice. The twins were the ones who walked out. Robert said Thorne didn't see them as human. He saw them as a weapon. He locked them away, starved them, and eventually subjected them to a grueling mummification process while they were still clinging to life. He called the finished product the two-faced sovereign. He believed it was a cursed object that could bring down entire nations. To make it even worse, he supposedly cut open the mummy's torso and stuffed it with the powdered bones of executed rebels and traitors from the Civil War, people who died hating the country. I asked him what the point was, and Robert's voice went cold. He started listing off disasters from the early 20th century. The Great Salem Fire of 1914, the Eccles mine explosion that killed nearly 200 men, the Black Tom explosion in 1916, the Great Atlanta Fire in 1917, the Hammond circus train wreck, the Knickerbocker Theater collapse. He claimed that every single one of those tragedies happened in a city where the cult had moved the box. He said the ultimate goal was the total destruction of the American government. On the day of the Great San Francisco earthquake in 1906, the dates don't perfectly align, but he was talking about a massive, unexplained catastrophe in 1923 that leveled a huge portion of the coast. Right before that happened, Malachi Thorne committed suicide by slitting his own throat with a cavalry sword right in front of the sovereign. His last words were written in blood on the floor: "The end of the Republic." I asked Robert how the box ended up in that Pennsylvania chapel, but he wouldn't tell me. He just said his father had been tasked with guarding it 30 years ago and had failed to dispose of it properly. I asked where the box was now, and he said he didn't know. He said his father had disappeared a few days ago, right after taking the box back. He'd been seeing strange black cars following him, and then he just vanished. Before he hung up, I asked him why he told me all of this. Robert just laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "My father told you, didn't he? You won't live long enough for the secret to matter. Don't call me again." That was the end of the conversation. I don't know if I believe all of it. It sounds like a campfire story, a urban legend, but I haven't been able to sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see that two-headed thing in its boxing stance, waiting to throw a punch that's been winding up for 100 years. I feel sick to my stomach, so I'm going to stop here. If I find out anything else, I'll let you know. But for now, I'm just trying to stay looking over my shoulder.
Chapter 11. The House by the River. I had just finished up a business trip in a small, out-of-the-way town when I found myself pausing on the walk back to my car. The evening air carried a scent that hit me with a sudden, sharp wave of nostalgia. It was the smell of damp earth, crushed grass, and the sweet, heavy aroma of aging timber. It reminded me of a town I'd visited once as a child for a relative's funeral. Since I'd finished my work ahead of schedule, I decided to take a stroll through the old downtown district before heading back to my hotel. Most of the storefronts were shuttered behind rusted metal grates, and there were very few people on the sidewalks, but the sunset reflecting off the brickwork and the vintage architecture felt like a preserved slice of mid-century America. I walked through the entryway and into the dining room. To my surprise, the furniture was all still there, perfectly preserved. A set of ceramic plates and coffee mugs sat on the heavy oak table, looking as if someone had just finished a meal and stepped away for a moment. The sunset filtered through the gaps in the heavy curtains, illuminating dust motes that drifted in the air, moving with a slow, unnatural rhythm that seemed to ignore the passage of time. Suddenly, a voice creaked from behind me. I spun around to find an old woman standing in the shadows. She was hunched over, her hair a wild white mane, wearing a faded, tattered floral dress. But her eyes were startlingly clear, sharp and piercing. "You have a lot of nerve wandering in here like this," she said. Startled, I immediately began to stammer out an apology. I'm so sorry. I was just passing by, and the house looked so historic. I didn't mean to intrude." The old woman's mouth twisted into what might have been a smile. "Historic? I suppose that is one word for it. This house has been waiting for someone for a long time." Just as I was about to ask what she meant, something caught my eye. The mugs on the table had multiplied. Where there had been 2, there were now 4, then 6. The room began to feel crowded, as if invisible people were filling the empty spaces around me. I strained my ears and heard a faint, rhythmic whispering. It sounded like a mix of low laughter and muffled sobbing. "This place shouldn't be inhabited," I whispered, my voice trembling. The old woman turned her face toward me slowly. "People stay, even after they have no right to," she rasped. "The things the world forgets are always the ones that hold on the tightest." As she spoke, the light in the room seemed to die. The sunset outside vanished, replaced by a sudden, oppressive darkness. Around the dining table, shadowy figures began to manifest. They were blurry, their faces featureless smears of gray, but I could feel their cold, heavy presence. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard it hurt. "This house calls to the ones the river took," the old woman whispered. "The river?" I remembered then. I'd heard stories about the river that cut through this town, how the currents were treacherous, and how the local papers were always reporting on bodies being pulled from the silt. "Have you heard of the anchor stone?" she asked. I shook my head, unable to find my voice. There is a massive, jagged stone at the bottom of the deepest part of the channel, she continued. They say if you touch it, you are marked. You'll be swept away and drowned for sure. The souls of those pinned under that stone have nowhere to go, so they crawl their way here. The whispering rose to a frantic, wet gurgle, and the air in the room became thick and heavy, like I was breathing underwater. The shadows began to stand up, moving toward me with jerky, unnatural steps. I knew I had to run, but before I could move, the old woman lunged forward and grabbed my wrist. Her hand was impossibly cold, like a block of ice. You saw it, didn't you? The stone in the water. I remembered the bridge. I remembered looking down and seeing a dark, hulking shape beneath the surface. I hadn't been able to look away. Then you belong to us now, she hissed, pulling me toward the table. Sit down. Join the family. I felt a surge of pure, primal terror. With a desperate yell, I wrenched my arm back as hard as I could. Her sleeve tore, and I saw the skin underneath. It wasn't human. It was gray, bloated, and sloughing off in wet patches, like a corpse that had been submerged for weeks. The woman's face shifted, her skin bubbling with waterlogged rot, her eyes turning milky and blind. A thick, muddy sludge began to ooze from her mouth. She wasn't a person. She was the caretaker of the drowned, a monster fed by the river's harvest. I bolted for the door, my boots thudding against the rotting floorboards. Behind me, her voice chased me, a low, gurgling roar. You can't leave. Sit down. Stay with us. The front door slammed shut on its own, trying to trap me inside, but I threw my entire weight against it, bursting through the wood and tumbling out into the overgrown yard. I didn't stop. I scrambled through the mud and the weeds, sprinting back down the narrow path until I hit the main road. By the time I reached the street lights of the downtown area, the world was bathed in the quiet dark of a normal night. I stopped to catch my breath and looked back. There was nothing there but a dense thicket of brush and a crumbling stone wall. The path, the house, the oak tree, it was as if they had never existed at all. I've been back to that town a few times for work since then, but I could never find that lane again. When I asked the locals, they just shook their heads and said they'd never heard of such a place. Only one person, an old man who ran a dusty antique shop near the outskirts, seemed to know what I was talking about. "Ah, the dead man's house," he muttered, his eyes fixed on a pile of old watches. "So it's still standing then." According to him, that house had once been a temporary morgue back in the late 1800s, a place where they kept the bodies pulled from the river until their families could claim them. Over the decades, the grief and the lingering spirits of the unclaimed had curdled into something malevolent, and the house itself began to hunt. Anyone who wandered in was pulled down into the dark. "You're a lucky man," the shopkeeper said, giving me a look that made my skin crawl. Ever since that day, I can't cross a bridge or walk near a pier without stopping. I find myself leaning over the railings, staring into the dark water, searching for the shadow of a stone hidden in the depths. And in the back of my mind, in the quietest part of my soul, I can still hear that old woman's wet, gurgling voice. "Sit down," she whispers. "Sit down. Stay with us."
We have traveled through the cracks in the mundane, through rooms that shouldn't exist and futures already written in digital ink. These stories leave us with a heavy question. How much of your life is truly your own? Perhaps we are all just rentals or shadows waiting for a light that will never change. As you return to your world, look closely at the faces in the crowd and the notifications on your screen. The line between being seen and being erased is thinner than you imagine. Thank you for joining me in the dark. Sleep well, if the silence allows it. But before you close your eyes, ask yourself, is that your own hand reaching for the light, or is something else merely guiding your reach?